Government's war on the poor. How does it affect us and what does it look like? Keep watching and you'll find out. Thank you for watching. My name's Glenn Morgan, and this is We the Governed. And if you have paid attention to some of these other videos I've done, you know I'm reporting from Washington State, the state of the endless lockdown where Inslee has kept us in an emergency forever now. And I just want to be clear, this is a trigger warning for anybody who hasn't watched any of these videos before. Nothing I say has been approved by our local state Ministry of COVID Compliance. So if you only want to hear what the governor wants you to hear, please stop watching now, because that will include nothing that I'm going to be talking about. Now, even though I'm reporting from Washington, I want to make it clear that this video is really about a topic that affects all of us. It doesn't matter where we live in this country. And it's an issue that has been kind of close to my heart for a long time, particularly over the last 10, 11 years. I've been an activist and dealing with property rights and having lots of confrontations with bureaucracy and government and special interests who appear to profit from the most incompetent elements of government today. And I'm going to be talking then and focusing on how these policies and efforts that are oftentimes dressed up with language claiming and pretending to care about the poor or trying to help the community are actually directly harmful, most harmful to those who are on the lower income of the spectrum, whether you call us poor, whether you call us middle income, whoever we are. It really affects us more and hurts us, despite the fact that it always is dressed up as language saying that they're trying to help us. Now let's talk about the first thing, because this is the most obvious and it's actually gotten a lot of news attention lately, but it's this idea of inflation, which is essentially the process where government takes your money and through policies or things that they do, and they ensure that your money is going to be worth a lot less in the future. I'm being very simple here just in the interest of time, but essentially inflation is oftentimes caused, and I think most recently in particular it's been caused in part by the fact that the value of your money is being reduced in how much things you can buy. It means there's more money chasing fewer items, and that is reducing the value of the dollar. So the cost of food going up, the cost of goods going up, the cost of rent going up, all these things tend to be a symptom of inflation, where the value of your dollar is actually dropping. This is a practical standpoint. And when we look at inflation in the current context, it's become a very politicized subject, but there's nothing new about inflation. It's happened throughout the world many times when countries make really poor choices economically, and they decide that they're not going to protect their currency, or they're not going to ensure that it retains its value. And in this country, we particularly have the ability to actually print money like any country does. However, the Federal Reserve is printing it by the trillions. It used to be the concerns that we had were just billions of dollars being over budget or spending too much money, and it just seemed like a little esoteric argument in the corner, not affecting many people. But now that people are seeing this increase in inflation, probably the worst inflation increase, so reducing the value of the dollar that they've seen since at least the late 70s, which means a lot of people watching this video have never really lived through inflation before, unless they came from Venezuela or Zimbabwe. And so they generally don't quite understand how this really impacts them, and experiencing it for the first time is very tough and not easy, and it's difficult to totally address. You know, America gets away with this a bit because we oftentimes, our dollar is the reserve currency, and so we are able to get away with a lot more printing of money and distributing of money around the world, just because in a sea of countries probably doing mostly the same thing, our country still appears, our currency still appears to be slightly stronger or better off than many of those. But the reality is it's just reducing the ability of people on the lower end of the financial spectrum. They get hurt the worst, right? Because all this money is being tossed out there, and suddenly the dollars that they've saved or the dollars that they're making at their job aren't able to go as far. And so it really does change how you live your life. I think it's a direct war on the poor, and it's a policy being conducted at the federal level that is hard to change at the state level, but it nevertheless is something that we need to go back and address and recognize. It directly affects lower income, middle income people the most, and always has. The second thing, and this is primarily driven from the federal level, but in our state of Washington and other local states like California have certainly been horrific when it comes to addressing the cost of energy and basically creating policies and implementing policies and special interest-driven agendas that increase the cost of energy. And it's most obvious when you look at how much it costs now to go and fill up the fuel tank. It's almost twice as much as it was a year ago. And which one of these do you think is a tax on the poor, right? Is it the current cost where it's escalating in some places to be more than $5 a gallon? Or was it the cost back in the mid-90s or so, or earlier, where it was less than $1? Which one is the most hurtful and impactful to somebody at a lower income scale? Well, it's obvious that the more it costs, the more it's going to hurt somebody who has to drive their kids to school maybe, or has to drive some distance to go to work, or just simply has to function in society, because it turns out that fuel is used in almost all methods of delivery. So the food that gets to the grocery store, the supplies that get to the factory or the warehouse, all of them get hauled by some sort of vehicle that's using fuel. And if you're jacking up the cost of fuel and increasing the cost of energy, then it's going to mostly impact those in the lower end of the scale. That is part of the war on the poor. And it's a very elitist attitude that it oftentimes drives these types of policies, where they shut down pipelines, reduce oil energy independence, or they find ways of, in our state, Governor Inslee and the legislature, they love jacking up taxes. So gas taxes are endless. There's no ceiling on them, apparently, and they're just going to keep increasing them. So every time you have a gallon of fuel, a big chunk of that is this gas tax, which simply goes into the bloated bureaucracy, and it gets lost and wasted. The majority of it gets wasted, unfortunately, and malinvested. And that's a problem. They claim that they're doing transportation projects, but what they're really doing is they're using that money to bond it out so that it's just going to pay debt. And anytime they want to do a new project now, they're just going to simply go and raise another tax. So it's a problem. And the question is, when these energy costs go up, do local billionaires actually care? Does it really impact their lives? I just picked these three guys because Steve Ballmer, Bill Gates, and Nick Hanauer all live in Washington State, and they've been very politically involved. They dump a lot of money into a lot of progressive, quote-unquote, progressive causes, and they're heavily engaged in a lot of this process. Do they really care, though, if energy goes up? It has zero impact on their lives, zero. And so what are they really doing when they're funding a lot of these programs? Do they actually feel the pain that the regular person feels when the cost of fuel or energy increases? They don't. But yet they keep putting more money out there. And they keep supporting politicians like Governor Inslee here, who thinks it's a good idea to consider tearing out the dams on the Columbia River. This is just a lunatic idea that has been proposed by special interests, particularly the Green Movement, thinking that there's any good outcome that could occur by tearing out the dams on the Columbia River. One of the reasons why the Pacific Northwest has had such low cost of energy has been because of these hydroelectric dams installed by the generation of my great-grandfather, my grandfather's era, when they were actually putting in these huge dam facilities. And it wasn't just about producing power, it was also about controlling the flooding and providing irrigation to the agriculture for a huge multi-state area. And to suddenly decide that maybe taking those out has any rational thought, or that there's anything good about that, is significantly delusional. You have to have an Ivy League college degree to be stupid enough to think that that's a good idea. And yet what happens is that's what they're pushing. That affects not just the energy in my state, Washington, the cost of that energy, but it also affects it for 7 or 8 states around us, going all the way down to Northern California and down to Utah, over to Montana. Just huge impacts of crazy policies, and that increases the cost of the power bill, just the ability to live at home. You keep throwing these taxes and these regulatory ideas and then considering policies that really are going to be destructive, like tearing out the dams, the cost of energy just goes up, which, among other things, increases the cost of food production. Farming is a fundamental element. I'm sorry, we're going to have to do it no matter what people think. The only way to get food is you're going to have to farm it. Agriculture has been around with us for many thousands of years, and we're going to need to use it one way or another to feed all the people of the world. And to make the cost of food production increase all the time by increasing the cost of energy, that's one thing, and also the inflation issue, which then, of course, translates into higher costs for food or other issues, and then burden down farming with as many ridiculous and obscure regulations passed by people who have no idea what farming's about, and they like to increase the cost. And it doesn't matter whether it's the cost of eggs, if you happen to run chickens like I do with a free-range chicken flock, or if you happen to be out there in a combine trying to get wheat in the field, this war on the poor is because it primarily directs it increases the cost of food, which for lower income people is a bigger percentage of their income. That's how they direct their money. And to have that food escalating costs occur right now, in addition to fuel costs, in addition to everything else, that is directly impacting them, that's hurting them. And yet government policies just seem to keep promoting that type of an end result. Now, the supply chain, which is kind of neat, to me, this always seemed like a wonkish issue when I used to do product development and manufacturing, and we'd be trying to source some of our components from somewhere else. This is the type of thing that you get concerned about, right? My stuff's stuck on a ship, and I'm waiting for it to come into the port. And that is not fun. And now suddenly everybody's become aware of the backlog at the ports and the problems in the supply chain. And yet these problems have been going on for a long time, and there's been a lot of policy problems that have choices and ideas that probably sounded good at the time, but making sure you can't expand ports, make sure that you can't dredge or expand ports easily, making sure that you have policies that make truck driving a lot harder or the process of moving freight a much more difficult thing to occur. It tends to be like the straw that breaks the camel's back. You have regulatory ideas, stupid ideas, self-serving, grant grifting sort of operations that each pile a little bit more of a layer on top of it, and it makes it harder and harder to get things done. And when I look at some of these regulations and ideas that get tossed out all the time at the federal, state, or local level, it's clear that the people who are doing this has never done the jobs that they're trying to regulate. I had a commercial driver's license myself for a while when I was you had a truck delivery route that I had to work when I was in between college, I think it was my sophomore and junior year. And so I had to get a commercial driver's license and go through all that process. It's a great experience. And I'm going to tell you, once you've had that kind of experience, you start to realize how all these regulatory restrictions and rules and things that make it harder to do that job only increase the costs. And frankly, they hurt the people who are at that entry level or lower income level or trying to start maybe a new trucking business, and how difficult that process is when you have absurd and ridiculous regulations like what California has implemented that directly impacts the ability to move freight from the port to the border or just to get it anywhere. And the people keep pushing these ideas, and they get funded with these ideas all the time, and it's not a good thing. So the next thing I want to talk about, another part of the war on the poor that this has impacted me for a long time, and I've talked about it for years, is the central planning conceit, the idea that a bunch of bureaucrats in a room, whether that be at your city, your county, or your state level, usually all three, they coordinate and try to make it 3 times as difficult, where they decide that they can dictate and control every aspect of how you can live your life or grow your community, or whether or not you can put your house there, or how much, more importantly, they make you pay in order to eventually get your house put there. And central planning is nothing, there's nothing really new about this. This is an old idea. It's been around for a long time, well over 100 years. If you go back and you look at during the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, there were big debates between the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks over the perfect designed city and what would be the utopian city that a socialist future could actually have. And central planners have been supremely active in trying to implement one of these utopian visionary schemes of one kind or another. And the one thing we know about central planning is that it inevitably always produces results that are totally counter to what they claim to be trying to solve. And the theory is usually that they want to create these cities, walkable cities maybe, or transportation-friendly development cities, or some other dream where they can put everybody into an apartment complex like that. Now, interestingly enough, if you ever actually talk to central planners or follow them out, or the lobbyists who are pushing these ideas, they don't tend to want to live there. They just think that you and I should. And they love pushing these schemes, but what does it really do? Well, the reality is the people who are super wealthy decide that this is the perfect city that they want to have, whatever it happens to be, environmental excuse, public train, where they're in love with trains, whatever the idea is that they have for the perfect utopian scheme. And they decide they know how to live your life far better than you ever could. And so they decide to fund a bunch of nonprofits to lobby and tell you how to live your life. And of course, also lobby and ensure that the politicians who get into office conform with their view and their utopian scheme that they want to see implemented in their community. So you have groups like FutureWise that litigates against almost every jurisdiction in Washington state, that's constantly attacking property ownership and farming and rural living, and groups like Fuse that does the same, and then they also try to make sure they get elected officials in office, and Progress Alliance, which has been funded largely by Nicanauer and others in Washington state to go and push these really bad ideas that are destructive and harmful to people on the lower income scale, and they don't care. But eventually they get tired of spending just their own money, and so they use this lobbying ability, both in getting elected officials in there and pushing these schemes, to then hire rooms full of bureaucrats. And to push these central planning schemes, these high-rise developments, and inevitably bloating bureaucracy this way so that they can outsource their dreams and schemes to the local government, and so they don't have to pay so much, so they can get that local government to pass new taxes and collect more money to fund this bloated bureaucracy, simply telling you how to live your life. And of course, they code it all in some kind of a green agenda or some kind of saving global warming or whatever they can convince you of is the scheme and dream for the day. And really what it does is it saves those billionaires a lot of money because they can get the government to do the work for them, and they love new taxes. And they pretend like they're going to pay them, but the reality is they won't pay much. But you and I will get stuck with those taxes and the increasing cost of our house or home if we choose to live there in the future. Because what happens is, here's an apartment complex from Kent. And a lot of people live there, and there's a lot of apartment complexes like this, South King County, South Snohomish County, but really all over Washington State. There's a lot of people who live in apartments, and I've doorbelled apartments all over Washington State. And I'm always interested in talking to people who live in apartment complexes, find out what they think about issues. And the one thing I'm going to tell you I almost never find is when I meet somebody and I'm talking to them and they live in an apartment complex and they never tell me, I am living the dream right here. This is my highest aspiration. I love it. I don't want to go anywhere. I want to pay rent on this place forever. This is where I want to live. Never. Nobody ever says that. They always say, listen, this is my first step up, or this is an improvement over where I lived before. Trying to save some money. I'm trying to get things organized for a better job, or to get through school, or to get a different education, or to be able to kind of get a nest egg so that I can buy that new place that I'm hoping to save, I'm saving for. An apartment tends to be a transitory sort of experience for most people. And yet this is really where the central planners want everybody to live. And their policies push this all the time. And they hate home ownership, and yet most people actually want to live and have their own home, their own place, however small and modest it might be, or perhaps it starts out modest and they move up over time. This is what people want. Even though roughly half the country today rents and half the country owns a home, the reality is most of those people who rent, good percentage of them, do eventually want to have a home or a place that they can call their own at some point in time. And yet this is the thing that many of these very wealthy planning groups don't want you to have. A lot of special interests don't want you to have a home. They don't want you to have that kind of home ownership. And I view this as part of the war on the poor, increasing the regulatory burden and the ability of people to survive living in those houses, increasing the taxes, increasing the regulations, making it increasingly difficult to just live there. Even if you can afford to buy it, your ability to actually live there becomes constrained by all these other increasingly costly escalations the cost of living. This is a war on the poor and the lower income and the middle class because it makes it very difficult for people to be able to survive and own homes. And yet I think that this ends up being an element that most Americans want to have. And increasing the costs further pushes that dream or that idea away from what most of those people would be able to afford. This is part of the war on the poor, that increasing, escalating costs of all these things. Now, here's something that people don't tend to talk about, in my opinion, that is a direct war on the poor as well, which is this increasing crime. Now, we're experiencing an unusual crime wave all across the country, especially in urban areas. And Washington State, where I live, has had a substantial increase in crime, all different kinds of crime, violent crime as well as nonviolent crime. And part of this has also been affected by the defund the police movement, which has been very big in Seattle and has been very big with the progressive left. Let's take away the police. Somehow that's going to make the world a better place. And let's unleash as many violent felons as we possibly can in the community. Let them out early. Don't make them pay bail. And don't even enforce a bunch of the laws. I'm sure that produces the utopia that the progressive left have always wanted us to have. Seattle's a good example of these poor choices. And now you see things where they do heat maps, crime heat maps around Seattle, for example, or headlines, of course, with the more violent and obvious crimes that happen. And there's more and more of these all the time right now. This is an element of increasing the crime. But I think something that people oftentimes forget is that there's a lot of crime that occurs that doesn't make headlines. It just tends to be the escalating property crime that you see occurring throughout the communities of Washington and all over the country. So things like breaking into cars, cutting off the catalytic converters, stealing your vehicle, breaking into your house or your apartment complex while you're gone. And these have a really disproportionate, significant impact on the poor. The poor and middle class are the ones who suffer the most at the hands of crime and criminals. And it's because they can't defend themselves. And you're in an environment in which they being the criminals, know that there's a bunch of people concentrated in this apartment complex. I just remember I've had family members that have lived in them, and one of the things they always complained about was having the cars broken into, or all the crime, the apartments being broken into when they were at work. All these things that tend to happen in those environments, they happen a lot more right now when the police are defunded, they can't show up, and this little progressive idea of cutting the police and then also making sure the DAs, the district attorneys, are deciding that they're not going to enforce most of these types of quote-unquote lower-level crimes. And these types of crimes really disproportionately affect somebody who's on the lower income scale. I remember when I was just getting started and my car was broken into, it was a significant event for me. Getting that window fixed, getting that lock repaired, getting the damage done to the, actually I couldn't even fix the damage that was done to the car, but that type of thing really affects you when that's a huge chunk of your income right now that just got flushed down the drain just because nobody's enforcing the laws, and these guys, criminals, are going to be out there. Now listen, criminals aren't going to suddenly go away tomorrow because you pass some magical law, but you definitely have a much bigger problem when most of them realize that nobody's enforcing any law and that they're going to be able to get away with this almost every time. And when this becomes a profit motive and a profit center, particularly for more organized crime with retail theft and all these other things going on, this has a big impact on people, and it's obnoxious, it's annoying. You have to go to the store, and even at Walmart, you can't get to those items that you just want to go buy. You have to try to find some kind of a attendant or somebody who works there to actually get access to those items because the retail theft has gone on so much. And they've increased the cost to make up for the fact that all this stuff's being stolen. And that's another problem. That just further escalates the cost and affects people who are poor and middle class. And yet, the left in particular, but those who are, I think, very elitist in their attitude and the demeanor towards the policies that they push, they don't mind this. They don't care. It doesn't have any impact on them. Look at these guys. Do you really think any of these guys care that much or are directly affected by the fact that crime is escalating? No, they don't. These guys have their own security teams. They live in palatial estates with lots of security around them. They never go out without an armed security guy watching them, and I don't blame them for that. I'm just saying that they aren't affected by it, and yet they push policies that do affect those of us who have to live in the real world and have to go out there. And I'm going to give you a specific example of one thing that all three of these guys have funded in this state. They hate the ability of the individual to be able to defend themselves. They hate the Second Amendment. They don't like the fact that you have the right to defend yourself and buy a firearm to defend yourself. And these guys have specifically, all three of them, have funded repeatedly efforts to try to reduce the ability of you as a citizen to defend yourself. And I know I've challenged one of the ballot title challenges when they did Initiative 1639, and I know it cost them. They didn't care. They just threw a couple million more dollars into that effort. These guys don't care. They're unaffected by these types of regulations, and yet it affects the rest of us pretty substantially. If you don't have enough money to hire the security team that they have, you have to make a choice. If you're going to protect yourself, you're going to buy your own firearm to protect you and your family. And that's something that these guys don't like. So this is a very elitist attitude, and they use government to push their dreams and schemes on the rest of us, and that's part of government's war on the poor. And it makes it harder when you live in an apartment complex like this if you can't defend yourself. And that isn't where you want to live. At least it's not where you want to live forever. You want to live there and then move on. And yet government makes that harder. Let's talk about education. I don't think we talk about this enough when it comes to the war on the poor, and government is directly responsible for this. Now, I'm using the image here of the Superintendent of Public Instruction in Washington State. Chris Reichdel is the Superintendent of Public Instruction. He's the one that's the equivalent of the Department of Education for our state, and he's the one in charge. And there's a very big push lately in public education to do a lot of things that actually, over time, I don't think it's made public education better at all. This is where OSPI is located in downtown Olympia. This is the Department of Education for Washington State. Nice building. This is where they're located, and they have a lot of bad outcomes there. And here's some of the challenges that public education has today. My wife is a public school teacher. I was on the school board. My kids are in public school. I care about these issues, and I'm going to tell you that this is a direct attack on people who are in the lower middle class income area because even though we're throwing more money than ever before into education, especially in our state, the results are not better. They don't get better. They're getting worse. So the more money we toss at it, the worse it gets for the students. And that's all that matters is, are the kids, the students coming out of education, are they in a better shape than they were before? No, all this money that's gone in to help them hasn't helped them at all. It has helped the adults, though, because we have an adult-centric approach to education, not just in Washington, but throughout the country. And it ignores the results for the kids. And this mostly impacts lower and middle income sort of kids, because unlike the wealthy folk that are able to get special tutoring, or they put their kids in private school, or they make an effort to do that anyway, most people that have their kids in public school probably can't afford that, and they're the ones who get hurt the most. One of the things that we've seen, especially since COVID has kicked in, although it's been an ongoing problem for a while, is this idea of grade inflation, dropping standards. And so they being the public education bureaucracy, doesn't want to measure skills of the kids that are graduating from the education system. And so they lower the standards, and they simply have grade inflation. Great kid, we're going to move you on. Whether or not you learned how to do math, or whether or not you're even literate, we're just going to keep moving you on because everybody's a winner and no one fails. And that doesn't help anybody. If you're a hardworking student who's getting C's and you realize that the kids who do nothing still pass just like you do, it disincentivizes the drive that a student would have to improve their situation in school. And this progressive political priorities being emphasized, and while they ignore the obvious educational failures that are going on around them, is really a disastrous side of the outcome. Now, we saw that in some recent elections in Virginia, where you see this emphasis on critical race theory, which does exist. Chris Reichtel is a strong proponent of every aspect of critical race theory. Now that it's become a word that he probably doesn't want to be associated with, he'll try to backpedal it, but he personally lobbied to put it in to every school in Washington State. And also sex education. This is this very sexualized sort of education for young kids that is not what parents wanted, and those are his priorities. That's what he cared about, not the collapsing education ability of the kids coming out where they have to go to the community colleges, can't even take them in because they have to go reteach them math and English before they can even function in a college environment. This is not effective education. So by basically destroying choices, reducing options, and having a one-size-fits-all approach to education, you make it hard. The bureaucracy makes it hard, very profitable for themselves, very profitable for the special interests that don't care and who make a lot of money the worse education gets, but not very helpful for parents and kids who are especially lower income, middle income folk who cannot, they don't have any other choice. That's where they're going. They're putting their kids in school, and yet they find out that their kids are so-called graduating with total illiteracy. That doesn't help anybody. And that is a direct war on the poor. It ensures those kids don't have the opportunities. Some of them can kind of catch up maybe later on. There's plenty of success stories of people who overcome really difficult challenges. But when you don't have any other choices, and when the educational establishment really attacks homeschooling, or they attack private education or school choice of any kind, and all to protect their own fiefdom and their cash pot that they have there, that's a war on the poor. Chris Reichtel, for example, right now has been very angry that all these parents are pulling their kids out of school. COVID has done, if nothing else, woken up a lot of parents as to what they're being taught. And when they listen to these Zoom education sessions, they're realizing that public education isn't exactly what they thought it was when they were in school, and it hasn't gotten better, and it's probably gotten worse in many cases, and so they're pulling their kids out of school. And what's happening is that's reducing how much money the state gives to public education, because at least in our state, Washington State, they give money by the students. They attach a certain amount of money based on how many students are going to that school. If you lose 10% of those students because they aren't coming back now, suddenly there's less money going to the school. And again, adult priorities are to keep the money flowing. The grant grifting operations have to keep coming. We've got to make sure that all the money stays there. So he lobbies to keep that money there and have the legislature change the law so he gets the money. He won't put that much energy into trying to get the kids literate again. Forget that. That doesn't matter. It's these special purpose priorities, which I think and argue, and I'm going to continue to argue, have a directly disproportionate impact on lower income, middle income people. They're the ones that get hurt. The regular people like us are the ones who get impacted by this. Now, do the billionaires care? And this one I have to be more clear, because it's very clear in the past that this problem has been recognized by Bill Gates and I believe Steve Ballmer as well. very explicitly. Bill Gates had, even about 10 years ago, really gone public, especially about the collapsing math standards and the literacy rate problems that we're having with the public kids coming out of public education. And to their credit, they did put a lot of money into trying to make some kind of reform, which is largely seems to be abandoned at this point in time. And instead of trying to make the reform, and it doesn't mean that they're always pushing the best ideas, but at least there was some recognition that there's a problem there. And instead, it seems like they've abandoned it. Let me tell you, none of their kids are going to be suffering from anything related to a collapse in the public education system, at least not directly. They have the ability to afford whatever special training or special schooling that they want to give to their kids. They don't have to send their kids, and didn't send their kids generally, to public school. So this is a real issue. Now suddenly you have two classes of people, and the people who are pushing absurd and progressive, adult-centric policies in education, they aren't the ones who are suffering when those experiments don't go well. And these kids come out and they're basically not able to function in the real world. I believe that that is a war on the poor and that it's a problem. So I've talked about about 5 different issues, dominant issues here, that I think are part of government and bloated bureaucracy's impact on the poor and middle income, lower income people in this state, in this country. So what do you do to make that change? What do we have to do to fix this? And one thing that just has to start happening is we have to stop bloating government and bureaucracy. The bigger government gets, the smaller people are. And the more we outsource to government, so the bureaucracy makes those decisions for us, then the fewer choices that we have in our life. And it doesn't get better. Central planners are not very good. They have a terrible track record. They fail pretty much universally wherever we give the bureaucracy control. The end result is usually far poorer and much worse than it would be if we had the freedom to innovate and make our own choices and decisions. Most people individually want to make their own decisions. Government's not going to do it better for us. We have to stop funding and bloating government just to do it. We need to just stop doing that. Now, we also have to stop the out-of-control spending and the cash printing. This is a federal issue. You can't do much at the state level to stop it. And in fact, the states tend to encourage it because everybody has their hand out for federal grants. But that's something that we have to do if we want to get inflation under control and restore some sort of credibility to the dollar, then, which is important if you care about people who are saving money, especially that lower middle income sort of area, the people most impacted by this. And we have to stop it. We just can't keep bloating government or wasting money on malinvestment and terrible choices and decisions. We have to restore the rule of law. We can't encourage lawlessness and reward it with these crazy district attorneys or this effort to eliminate police departments or general rule of law with bad judges or laws that simply decriminalize violent behavior or really bad actions. I have no problem with basic. There are reforms that I've testified in front of the legislature, civil asset forfeiture, for example, which I think is abused a lot, and there's other things that could be changed, but that doesn't mean you eliminate the rule of law for regular people, and you still have to have some punishment for those who are going to go out and victimize the rest of their community. So generally, what tends to work for those of us who care about freedom and liberty, and it seems to work every time it's tried, is to give people more choices. Don't try to have government be the entity that controls them or special interests that profit from government. Those are the ones who are rewarded right now. That's not how we should have things moving forward. If we care, if we want to pretend to care even about the poor and the middle class, those are the policies, that's the approach that I would try to take to fix some of this. So there is a war on the poor. We don't want it to continue. We want it to stop, and we want to fix it so that it doesn't continue. And there's a lot of big special interests that would be on the other side of us in this fight. But I think it's one that we have to have if you care about freedom and liberty and the future of our state or our country. So with that, thank you for, this has been a long video. I want to encourage you, if you want to learn more about We the Govern, go down below. You can subscribe to our email newsletter if you want to see new articles that we post up. And don't forget to subscribe and to share this video with others if you care. As anybody who knows me knows, I'm a strong proponent of activism, getting involved locally, and trying to make a difference in your local government. I really believe this strongly because, in the end, the future belongs to those who show up.